Good day. I'm Engineer Rubiano, your Chemistry for Engineers instructor. Our topic for today is chemical safety. The following will be our objectives. Why do we need to study chemical safety? Ano ba yung importance niya? Recently, we heard from the news about the explosion on Beirut, Lebanon. According to the investigations, the explosion was caused by the intense rapid burning of ammonium nitrate na hindi na-store properly. And this is one major reason to study chemical safety, which is para makaiwas tayo sa mga accidents na pwedeng idulot ng mga chemicals na ginagamit natin. Another is to prevent exposure from chemicals that may lead to potential hazards, or para alam natin paano mababawasan or ma-avoid to have contact with a harmful chemical. Lastly, is to develop attitude toward safety and acquire habit of assessing hazards and risk. Ito yung kailangan natin as engineers to make sure that our workers will have a safe working environment. Tayo yung mag-a-assess if may hazard or risk sa ating workplace. Before proceeding with the chemical hazards, dapat alam muna natin kung paano pumapasok yung mga chemicals sa ating katawan or yung routes of entry of chemicals. Meron tayong tatlong ways, which are dermal exposure, inhalation, and ingestion. Iisa-isahin natin sila. The first one is dermal exposure, or tinatawag ding absorption, wherein the chemicals enter through our skin or sa ating eyes. Also, toxicity of the chemical depends on the degree of absorption that occurs when it penetrates the skin. Ibig sabihin, mas magiging toxic yung chemical kapag mas malalim yung na-penetrate niya sa balat. In addition, organic chemicals are much more likely to penetrate the skin than inorganic chemicals. And an example of organic chemical is alcohol. Lastly, chemicals can cause mild temporary discomfort to permanent skin damage. Pwedeng mag-cause lang siya ng irritation or worse, malalapnos or masusugat yung balat mo. The next route of entry is via inhalation, wherein chemicals in the form of gases, mists, vapors, fumes, and dust entering through the nose, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. Simply, inhalation is through our nose. Naalala nyo ba during the Taal volcano eruption? We were advised na magsuot ng mask. Kasi daw, nung inobserve nila under the microscope yung mga dust during the eruption, nakita nila na parang broken glass or bubog yung mga dust particles. That can damage the lung surface. The last route is through ingestion, which involves chemicals entering through the mouth into the gastrointestinal system. This is the reason kung bakit bawal tayong kumain or uminom inside the laboratory. Kasi baka mamaya, sa halip na tubig yung inumin natin, is chemical pala yung nainom. And that is very dangerous. Now we know how chemicals enter in our body. But what are the types of hazards that chemicals have? We have 7 types of chemical hazards, namely corrosives, oxidizers, flammables, explosives, toxic chemicals, pyrophoric, and water-reactive chemicals. Let's discuss them one by one. Starting with corrosives. which can cause destructive burns on the site of contact. Ibig sabihin, once na natapon sa balat mo, itong mga substances na ito, ay pwede silang mag-cause ng burns or sugat. Ito din yung mga strong chemicals that can cause corrosion kapag nabuhos sila sa metals. These chemicals can affect the respiratory tract via inhalation and the gastrointestinal tract via ingestion. Some examples are strong chemicals such as sulfuric acid, nitric acid, and potassium hydroxide. Another type of chemical hazard is oxidizers, which are chemicals that decompose readily under certain conditions to yield oxygen. Ito yung mga chemicals na makikita usually nakastore on brown bottles. Kasi kapag tinamaan sila ng direct sunlight, nagde-decompose sila and nagpo-produce sila ng oxygen. And that oxygen can cause a fire to burn violently. Dahil ang oxygen is one requirement to produce fire. An example of oxidizer is ammonium nitrate, which caused the explosion on Beirut, Lebanon, dahil it was not properly stored. Kaya ang nangyari, it produced oxygen that caused a huge fire and explosion. And dahil nga pwedeng mag-cause ng fire ang mga oxidizers, they must not be stored with flammables. Other examples of oxidizers are potassium permanganate, sodium nitrates, and chlorates. The next type of chemical hazard is flammables, which are substances that readily catch fire and burn in air. Madali silang mag-combust or madaling masunog. And they must not be stored with oxidizers. Some examples are ethanol, which is used for alcohol, and acetone na ginagamit to remove nail polish. Next, we have explosives, which are chemicals that when subjected to heat, impact, or friction, undergoes rapid chemical change that can cause increase in pressure. Kapag tumaas yung pressure niya, pwede siyang sumabog. If it encounters heat, light, mechanical shock, and certain catalysts that can initiate explosive reactions. Some examples are acetylides, azides, and perchlorate salts. We also have toxic chemicals, which are chemicals that produce injuries or lethal effects upon contact with body cells due to their chemical properties. These are very harmful chemicals. Toxic effects of a chemical may occur after a single or acute exposure. Ibig sabihin, kahit isang exposure lang, mararamdaman mo na agad yung effect. For example, natapunan ka ng sulfuric acid. Mararamdaman mo agad na mapapaso ka at makikita mo na magkakaroon ka ng burns. Or pwede rin na long-term, repeated, chronic exposure. Ito usually yung na-experience ng mga nagtatrabaho sa companies na nag-handle ng mga toxic chemicals. Dahil araw-araw silang pumapasok, nag-accumulate sa katawan nila yung chemicals. And after ilang years, saka pa lang nila mararamdaman yung effect. Some examples of toxic chemicals are mercury that can be found in thermometers. It affects the nervous system and kidney. Other chemicals are carbon monoxide that targets blood. We have chloroform that targets the liver, and organic solvents that targets the skin. The next type of chemical hazard is pyrophoric chemicals, which are substances that ignite spontaneously upon contact with oxygen or moisture in air. These chemicals need extra care and they usually need a separate building kung saan hindi sila magkakaroon ng contact with oxygen or moisture dahil pwede siyang masunog. An example is triethyl aluminum that is used for the production of plastics. The last type of chemical hazard is water-reactive chemicals, which are substances that react violently upon contact with water. Kaya once na nagkaroon ng sunog, hindi basta-basta pwedeng buhusan ng tubig. Kasi baka yung nasusunog is water-reactive, and sa halip na mapatay yung apoy, is mas lalo pang lumaki. A special type of fire extinguisher is used for water-reactive chemicals. Some examples of water-reactive chemicals are lithium, sodium, and potassium. Now we know how the chemicals enter in our body, and what type of hazards meron yung mga chemicals. But how do we know the hazard of a certain chemical if hindi naman natin sa ulo lahat ng chemicals? Diyan papasok yung tinatawag na Globally Harmonized System or GHS of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. This is created to easily identify the hazards of a chemical. This system uses illustrations para mas madaling ma-recognize ng mga tao yung mga hazards. The following are the recognized GHS and their meanings. Una is health hazard, which is represented by this picture, which means that the chemical is a carcinogen and mutagen, can cause reproductive toxicity, a respiratory sensitizer, toxic to target organs, and can cause aspiration toxicity. Another symbol is flame, which means na yung chemicals is pwedeng flammable, pyrophoric, self-heating, emits flammable gas, self-reactive, or organic peroxide. We also have the well-known skull and crossbones symbol, which means that the substance can cause acute toxicity or it is fatal or toxic. We also have the exploding bomb symbol, which means that they are explosives, self-reactives, or organic peroxides. Then we have the flames over circle, which means that the substance is an oxidizer. We also have the exclamation mark symbol, which means that it is an irritant, a skin sensitizer, can cause acute toxicity, narcotic effects, and is a respiratory tract irritant. Also, it is hazardous to the ozone layer. Another is the corrosion symbol, which means that it can cause eye damage, skin corrosion or burns, and it is corrosive to metals. Then we have the environment symbol, which means that the chemical can cause aquatic toxicity. And lastly, we have the gas cylinder symbol, which means that the gases are under pressure. These symbols are usually found on the containers of the chemicals para mas madali silang ma-recognize ng mga tao. Aside from the GHS, paano ba natin malalaman yung routes of entry at yung hazards ng mga chemicals if napakarami ng mga chemicals na meron tayo sa mundo? Aside from the GHS, we have what we call the Safety Data Sheet, or SDS, also known as Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS. It provides basic information on a material or substance, and different countries have different content requirements for SDS. Para pare-pareho yung format ng ating SDS, gumawa si American National Standard Institute or ANSI ng Internationally Harmonized SDS containing 16 sections. SDS is obtained when we purchase chemicals. And kailangan nabasa mo na yung kanyang SDS before mo gamitin yung chemical. Bakit? Ano yung importance ng SDS? Number 1, it provides basic information for the material. Lahat ng kailangan nating malaman regarding the chemical is available on the SDS. Another is, it aids in the development of health and safety program for the material. Since as engineers, we are in charge of making sure that yung mga hawak nating personnels or workers are safe. Tayo yung magde-develop ng mga practices na kailangan yung gawin when handling chemicals. Number 3, it informs the user on the environmental impact and proper disposal of the material. Dapat, pag gumamit tayo ng chemicals, we are also aware kung ano yung nagiging effect niya sa environment at kung paano natin i-dispose yung material after natin siya gamitin. Lastly, it provides transport and regulatory information of the material. Yung mga chemicals, hindi pwedeng basta-basta i-transport. Meron tayong mga batas or protocols na kailangang sundin when transporting chemicals, and the SDS can guide you on those regulations. Ngayon naman, i-discuss na natin isa-isa yung 16 sections ng SDS. We will use the SDS of sodium hypochlorite or yung ginagamit sa Zonrox or disinfectants, which is very useful during these times. Section 1 is the chemical product and company identification. It contains information that identifies the chemical and its manufacturer. This section also identifies the general use of the material. In the SDS of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin sa Section 1 yung kanyang product identifier, yung general use ng ating material, and yung details ng ating supplier. Section 2 is hazards identification. It describes ways you might be exposed to the harmful effects of the material or yung hazards na pwedeng idulot sa atin ng chemical. It is illustrated using the National Fire Protection Association hazard diamond. So, ito yung itsura ng hazard diamond. Hinahati siya sa 4. So, the red means flammability, yellow means instability, white means special hazards, and blue means health. Bawat division ni fire diamond is nilalagyan ng number. And the higher the number, ibig sabihin, mas malaki yung effect niya sa corresponding category na nakay fire diamond. Now let us look at the fire diamond of sodium hypochlorite. Makikita natin na it has the highest effect on health, followed by instability. Also, hindi rin siya flammable and wala siyang special hazards na ini-indicate. Also, in this section, makikita natin what type of chemical hazard si sodium hypochlorite. Makikita natin na siya ay corrosive, indicated by the GHS. So, it causes daw skin irritation and serious eye damage. And lastly, it is toxic to aquatic life. Section 3 is composition or information on ingredients. It contains the CAS number, which is a unique number assigned to chemicals by the Chemicals Abstract Service. It specifies chemical names of hazardous ingredients and exposure limits if available. Makikita dito yung harmful ingredients at yung maximum amount na pwede tayong ma-expose bago maka-experience ng toxic effects. On Section 3 of the SDS of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin yung composition ng ating chemical, which is made of water and sodium hypochlorite. Section 4 is about first aid measures. It instructs the user on what to do in case of exposure with the material. Kaya importante na bago natin gamitin si chemical is nabasa muna natin yung kanyang SDS. Para, in case of emergency, alam natin kung ano yung first aid na kailangan nating gawin. Looking at the Section 4 of SDS ng sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin dito yung mga first aid measures na kailangan gawin kapag nagkaroon ng exposure sa chemicals. Section 5 is firefighting measures. It describes any fire hazards related to the material, and it provides the appropriate type and placement of fire extinguishers. So, bawat chemicals, they require different fire extinguishers. So, dito natin makikita yan sa Section 5. Looking at the Section 5 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin dito yung kanyang preferred extinguishing media or yung kanyang fire extinguisher, the special hazards arising from the substance or mixture, and lastly, yung mga advice for firefighters na lalaban dun sa sunog. Section 6 is accidental release measures. It contains general instructions during accidental release or cleaning up spill. Kapag nagkaroon ng accident and natapon or nagkaroon ng spill yung chemical, nandito sa section na to yung instructions on what to do. Looking at the sample SDS, makikita natin sa Section 6 yung mga personal precautions para dun sa mga emergency personnel at sa mga emergency responders. Andito rin yung environmental precautions and yung methods and materials for containment and cleaning up. Section 7 is handling and storage. It contains general precautions and equipment needed for the safe handling of the materials. Dito natin mababasa kung paano natin dapat ini-store at hinahandle yung ating mga material. It gives advice on where to properly store the material. Looking at the Section 7 of SDS ng ating sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin dito yung mga precautions for safe handling, yung mga conditions na kailangan natin i-meet para magkaroon ng safe storage, kasama na din dito yung mga incompatibilities, and yung specific end use. For Section 8, Exposure Control or Personal Protection. It enumerates the procedures and practices to work safely with the materials. So, dito naman makikita yung mga paraan at yung mga practices na kailangan natin gawin para maging tayong safe when handling the material. To meet the requirement of the US or Canada for SDS, the following items are listed in the SDS. Number 1 is engineering or administrative controls, and number 2 is personal protective equipment. For engineering or administrative controls, it contains ways to control the potential hazard at its source, remove potential hazard from the general area, or put up a permanent barrier between the user and the potential hazard. Basically, it contains engineering method to control the potential hazard. And number 2, for personal protective equipment, it provides general guidance on the selection of proper personal protective equipment or PPE. Dito natin makikita yung mga kailangan nating protective equipment while handling the chemical. Dahil bawat chemical ay nagre-require ng different personal protective equipment. Looking at the Section 8 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin yung mga exposure controls kagaya ng engineering controls and personal protective equipment na kailangan natin para dun sa pag-handle ng chemical. Section 9 is Physical and Chemical Properties. It provides information on the physical and chemical properties of the materials. So when we have calculations na kailangan gawin and kailangan natin yung mga physical and chemical properties ni material, dito natin siya sa Section 9 hahanapin. Looking at Section 9 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin dito yung information on basic physical and chemical properties. So, andito yung mga properties niyan. Section 10 is stability and reactivity. It indicates how stable the material is. And it describes any conditions under which it is unstable or can react dangerously. Dito natin makikita yung mga situations kung saan yung ating material is unstable o kaya naman pwedeng mag-react vigorously or dangerously. And it lists materials to which it is incompatible with. Makikita din natin dito yung mga material na hindi natin pwedeng isama sa ating chemical. Looking at Section 10 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin dito yung kanyang information for stability and reactivity, kagaya ng chemical stability, possibility of hazardous reactions, conditions to avoid, yung mga incompatible materials, and lastly, yung mga hazardous decomposition products. Section 11 is Toxicological Information. It contains toxicity information. Dito natin makikita yung mga toxic effects na pwedeng idulot sa atin ng substance. Looking at Section 11 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin dito yung information on the toxicological effects. Section 12 is for ecological information. It describes the environmental impacts of the material if it is released to the environment. As engineers, it is part of our job to make sure that when the chemical is released in the environment, is hindi siya magkakos ng hazard. Looking at Section 12 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin that sodium hypochlorite is toxic to aquatic life. Section 13 is disposal considerations. It includes waste disposal information. So, nandito natin makikita kung paano natin properly madidispose yung ating chemical after use. Looking at Section 13 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin yung recommended waste treatment methods for its disposal. Section 14 is transport information. It provides necessary precautions during shipment or transport of the material. Kagaya ng nabanggit natin kanina, yung mga chemicals hindi pwedeng basta-basta natin i-transport. Meron tayong mga protocols or mga rules and regulations na kailangang sundin. And dito sa Section 14 natin, makikita yung mga yon. Looking at Section 14 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin dito yung mga informations and regulations na kailangan natin when transporting the material. Section 15 is regulatory information. It provides references to applicable health, safety, and environmental laws and regulations in relation to the material. So, lahat ng batas na related dun sa ating material is makikita natin sa Section 15. Looking at Section 15 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin dito yung mga US federal regulations and the international regulations. Lastly, we have section 16, which is other information. It includes supplementary information such as reference sources used in preparing the datasheet. So dito natin makikita lahat ng references na ginamit para mabuo yung SDS. So for section 16 of sodium hypochlorite, makikita natin yung other information na to. And that ends our discussions. Now, to review what we've learned, let's answer the review questions. So the instruction, use the safety data sheet of sodium hypochlorite to answer the following. We have 5 items. Try to answer them on your own before looking at the correct answers. These are the correct answers. Did you get the correct answers? So that ends our discussion. The following are the references used for this lecture. Thank you for listening until the end of this discussion.